I wanted to take a moment to do a video on Mark Lewisohn and just somewhat of an update, I guess, on the next volume of all these years. Now, many of you have been patiently waiting for volume 2 to come out. Some of you have been impatiently waiting, and some of you are downright angry that it hasn't been delivered. So anyway, I want to talk a little bit about Mark Lewisohn's process, some of the things that may have slowed him down, and as you may guess, his riff with Apple, which is the title of this video. Now, for those of you who don't know Lewisohn's work well, let me just give you a little background here. So he got started in the Beatles and writing about the Beatles in 1977 as a contributor to the Beatles Monthly magazine. He then did the Beatles Live, which is right here. And this was in 1986. And then he did the Beatles recording sessions in 1988. And this is the book that really put him on the map. And this was one of the books that allowed Beatle fans to start thinking about the Beatles in a little bit more historical fashion that was more rooted in documentation and wasn't so, in some cases, flowery and so heavily biased, I guess. And it left many people hungry for more of this type of writing. In 1991, he became the editor of Paul McCartney's fanzine, Club Sandwich. He also began working for McCartney, writing liner notes to Wingspan and to the 25th anniversary of Band on the Run. In 1992, he completed the Beatles Chronicle, the complete Beatles Chronicle. And then in the mid-90s, he started working on the anthology series and was writing liner notes for those CDs. In 1990, he contributed to In My Life, Lennon Remembered, the book that accompanied the 10-part BBC radio series on John Lennon. So he's got a long history with the Beatles. And the thing that he did next was Tune In. This is volume 1 of all these years. And I had the recording sessions book, but when I read this, I didn't know anything about this coming out. I was really surprised to see it. And what I ended up buying was the extended version, which is twice as long as the mass market version. So the relationship that Mark had with Apple, all these things I've just talked about, he had a relationship with the ex-Beatles and with EMI, and that it gave him special access to files, tapes, and interviews with McCartney and Harrison in this case. And he was kind of on the inside to a large degree. Now, this relationship with the Beatles and EMI, which is now the relationship would be with Apple, the Beatles corporation that runs their business, this has turned cold. Apple has frozen Mark Lewisohn out. And this is a little bit, initially when I heard this, I thought this was a very bad move on Apple's part because, first of all, I mean, Mark Lewisohn is doing this at no cost to them, and he needs their help in completing this history. And obviously, he's got a good pedigree here and did a lot of work with them and for them. And here they froze him out with no warning. So you might, from this, you might say, well, that might be harder for him to complete some of the information he wanted that he needed for this biography. And, you know, having been through a lot of their files already, he knows where he can get some of it. And the fact that they've withheld that, I think, is somewhat of a shame.
Apple is a lot of people. Apple is a number of people who sit on the board, but it's also ultimately 4 owners still. And I don't know who it is. Actually, I do know who it is, but I'm not saying who it is, that will be ensuring that I'm kept at arm's length. And hopefully that will change in time.
You were saying about the importance of independence, but have you ever had a sense that people have been told don't speak to Mark Lewisohn?
Yes. I'm my biggest beef, and I might as well say it, my biggest beef with Apple these days is the cowardice of how they've operated with me. Because I had a very strong relationship with Neil Aspinall and with Derek, and was part of 19 projects that made them a lot of money. Not just thanks to me, of course, but they wanted my input and valued my expertise enough to hire me and pay me and thank me for my services. But about 3 years ago, I was pursuing, actually it happened 3 times. I was 3 different archival inquiries that I was actually pursuing. And in each case, inexplicably, when I thought I'd jumped every last hoop that needed to be jumped in order to gain access, it would suddenly be shut off to me, and with no explanation. And on one of those occasions, somebody, and I obviously I won't say who, said to me, I shouldn't be telling you this, but we've been told not to cooperate with you. And we can't let you see anything. And I went, who told you that? And it was Apple. And I just thought, you bastards. You know, I'm trying to write your book here, and I'm trying to get it as right as possible by going to paperwork that no one's ever looked at and that's going to enhance the telling of this story even better. And you're not letting me see it, and you don't even know what it is you're not letting me see. You don't know anything about what's in that archive. But I'd like to see it so I can write your story better. And so I wrote a challenging email, and I said, I understand you're blocking me now. And I got a one-line dismissal back from my email, and I just thought, right, now I know who I'm dealing with here. But it's so unnecessary. It's so ridiculous. I'm trying to write their story, and they're stopping me.
Yeah.
And I'm someone that they can trust, and did trust. You know, I'm not some just, bloke they don't know.
That interview is from the excellent podcast Nothing is Real with Jason Carty and Stephen Cockcroft. Mark refused to divulge the identity of the gatekeeper at Apple that was responsible for keeping him out, but it may have to do with George Harrison's widow, Olivia Harrison, and more on that in a moment. Now, first of all, generally this rift with Apple, although it may have slowed him down in writing and completing some parts of this book and this biography, I think this is a good thing. I think the fact that Mark Lewisohn, this is an unauthorized biography. It's not been authorized by the Beatles or by Apple. And the reason that's good is because then Apple, if they have a say in it, they can't censor it then. Now, this is an opportunity in some ways because if you remember the anthology, which was an excellent piece of work that the Beatles put out, there was some censorship involved there that I think made it a little bit lighter weight than it really should have been. And I think that without Apple controlling Mark Lewisohn's hand, we will probably get a more honest telling of their history. Mark Lewisohn's relationship with Apple began to deteriorate a little bit in the late 80s. So this was brewing for a long time. And Mark was involved in some things that really had nothing to do with it, it had to do with bootleg recordings being released. Now, many of you collectors, like myself, were collecting bootlegs in the 80s, and this was really the time when they took off, especially when more CDs became available in the mid to late 80s, and CD bootlegs were just easier to produce, more cheap to produce, and we started seeing a lot of them, and things started getting leaked out. Now, how did this all involve Mark Lewisohn? Well, there was a guy that EMI that was on staff. He was an engineer named John Barrett. And I think Barrett was getting on in years, and I think they were kind of putting him out to pastures, and they gave him a job to do. Why don't you catalog these Beatle recordings? So his job was to go through all the tapes and label things and basically log what's on this vast library of tapes. You would have thought this would have been done long ago, but no. So John Barrett gets the job, and he compiled several tapes. I think he was even taking things home to listen to as well, so he's transferring some things to listen to. And some of these tapes were used for a presentation for a project called The Beatles at Abbey Road, and this was in 1983. And this was done by London DJ Roger Scott. And Roger Scott is a fairly famous DJ from London. I guess they were given the green light to do this project. And what happened was some of the tapes that were played and they were given to Roger Scott, he used them in a way, he was narrating over the top of them. He never played a full song. So it gave this real documentary feel. And for whatever reason, EMI didn't seem to have any problem with that. So that came and went. And then as a couple years went by, John Barrett passed away. And that was in 1984. And these tapes that were given to Roger Scott, he apparently hung on to them. So this information that was on these tapes, the first appearance on a bootleg came out with this bootleg called Beatles Not For Sale. And the songs that were on here were songs like the 1962 version of One After 909, the demo to Bad to Me, Leave My Kitten Alone If You Got Trouble, Goodbye, and several other alternate takes. And nobody said a whole lot about it at the time, but it's generally understood that the source of that came from Roger Scott. Now, Roger Scott ended up getting very ill, and he died of cancer in 1989. And it is said that he sold off a lot of these tapes that he had from John Barrett to bootlegger Dieter Schubert, and he's the guy that started the bootleg CD label Swingin' Pig. So at that point, '88, you started to see CDs like this, the Backtrack series, Swingin' Pig, Unsurpassed Masters, Ultra Rare Tracks. So some of this stuff started to surface on CD. Now, Mark was not blamed for this. Now, it just so happened that Mark had some access to this information, logs and tapes and things, but EMI wasn't really worried about Mark and his association, or they didn't think he leaked tapes or anything. But George Harrison started putting two and two together and coming up with 22. And this just gave the appearance that, at least to George Harrison, that Mark was the guy that was leaking this information.
I've never, ever leaked. And that was why it was so galling to be accused of being a bootlegger. George Harrison accused me of being a bootlegger to my face in front of a whole film crew, the bastard. Yeah. I mean, really, a horrible, horrible thing to do. I really should have done him for slander. Yeah. And in fact, at one point I was tempted, believe it or not, because, you know, I'm a professional, I'm on a shoot, yeah. I've got a whole unit with me, and he's accusing me of being a bootlegger in front of everybody. Which was, he had no evidence for, because there wasn't any. Yeah. But that didn't matter. He was accusing me without evidence, and it was wrong. And the irony of that was that I actually had started off really well with George. I knew George from '87, personally, and we'd had nice times. And it was one of the things that flipped it was when I began working regularly for Paul. Yeah. Yes. Because at one point, George said to a mutual friend, "I hope Paul takes good care of him," which was a nice thing to say, a very nice thing to say. I really appreciated that. But something about working for Paul, however, flipped George around, and I was no longer quite so well thought of. And then he started attacking me, and I never regained ground. Yeah. Yep. I don't know Olivia Harrison. I've never met her, which makes her thorough blocking of everything I do so ridiculous, because she doesn't even know me. Yeah. But if, as it would appear, she's taken it upon herself to perpetuate George's wishes, which is something that you might expect a spouse to do when their partner's died. If the partner says, "Don't ever allow this," then she would take it as her duty not to allow it. I'm guessing. Yep. But I think I can see that in her behaviour towards me, because she doesn't know me, so she can't be blocking me because of what, you know, I haven't done anything to her. But if George said, "Don't have anything to do with Mark Lewisohn," I'm not flattering myself that he did, but if he did, that would be a reason why she's not.
Let's talk a little bit about the process of his writing, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding on what it takes to actually deliver something on this scale. 10 years for each volume is kind of the time frame that was talked about. We're at 12 years here for volume 2. Who's counting? But I don't think, I know this may sound strange to some of you, but that to me sounds like it's about right. I think 10 years for each volume is actually pretty quick work. Now let me explain why I think that. Because first of all, Mark's method, he does this pretty much alone. He's had, I think, some people helping him out. There's been a lot of anti-Mark Lewisohn sentiment with regard to not delivering this on time for people. People want to read this before they die. You know, that's just not how life works, I'm afraid. I won't get to see everything before I die. And one of the things that I don't think people appreciate is the amount of research he has done on this. So he had moved houses a few years ago, and he had to move all of his Beatle archive material. And that was upwards of 14 tons of material. And I guess that wasn't everything. And that's some years ago already. So he's probably built upon that. So you can imagine the archive and having to retrieve information when he needs it. So people suggest, well, he should really hire some assistants. But, you know, I mean, sometimes it's easier just to get the information yourself than to actually take the time to train somebody and then have to pay that person. So there are other things at play here, taking the time to train and then payment. Mark Lewisohn was paid an advance to do this project, and this came out in 2013, and I think it was about 2003 when he was paid the advance. Now that's already a long time ago. And one thing people don't understand is that that's got to cover his expenses till volume 3 is delivered. So what that means is he's just not sitting behind a desk typing. He's had to go to different countries for research. He's got to pay for his travel. He may have to pay some of the people he's interviewing. He's got to pay for his lodging, meals. He's got to sometimes possibly pay for access to some of these archives that he wants to see. So this is not something you can do from your chair in your office. You actually have to go to the information. So that takes time, and I don't think people calculate either the time or the expense that entails. Now, his workday, my understanding is he does not a 9 to 5 workday, but a 5 to 9 workday. That's 5 a.m. to 9 p.m., 5 days a week. So 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. workday would be about an 80-hour work week, Monday through Friday, and he does put in weekends. I don't know how much he puts in on weekends, but if you actually calculate the hourly wage over all these years, I mean, we're talking like it's a paltry amount per hour, and you can calculate it based on the advance he was paid. And the reason I bring that up is not to make light of his work at all, quite the contrary. But this is a labor of love. Nobody would work this hard and over this long if it wasn't a labor of love. That you can't pay somebody enough to really do it more quickly. It can't really be done in that way. So this labor of love is not just something that he has to deliver, that he's doing for the fans, his fans, and for Beatle historians. He's got to do it and do it in a certain way for himself. He's set a bar, not just to deliver to the fans, but for himself. And I think we should just let him play his hand and not give him a hard time about taking too long. Now, he's had to do a couple other things to help finance some of this. He's done Hornsey Road, Evolver, 62. These things help him to continue to work and finance the writing of the book because, as I said, it takes quite a bit of resources to complete. So another thing that many people probably have not considered with regard to what it takes to write something like this. So I showed you the extended version here. This is the double version, or the double book. So this isn't really writing 3 volumes. It's really writing 6 volumes. Because what he has to do, when he signed up to do this, and he delivered this, it was 3 times the word count that they expected. And they said, well, what you did here is really good. We're going to put this out. But we need a mass market version as well, which is this. So to pare this down to this is like writing another story almost, because you have to subtract half of the material and link things up so that they fit together properly. That is not easy to do. I bet you if he didn't have to do that and he only had to deliver this, that would speed along the process. But people don't really consider that. And I have read this, and I read this twice, and it's very long, of course, but I guess most people will read the mass market version. Now, another thing I want to mention, I'm going to bring this out again here, the Beatles recording sessions. Mark still gets a lot of accolades over this book. However, Mark has kind of grown sour on his own work here for a couple of reasons. When he was signed to do this, the format was already decided by EMI, and there was a word count. And he realized that the format they decided upon wasn't going to work very well. So his hands were tied on both that and word count. And some of the information that he had, he didn't have complete information. And we know some of this information is not correct. So what he is doing is he is rewriting this entire book, and he's inserting it into volumes 2 and 3 of all these years. Now, I can't imagine how he's going to tie that into a normal narrative. The way I would do it, I'd probably have the chunks of the song separate. I don't know how he's going to do it, but that can't make the process quicker. I think it's basically shoehorning this into volumes 2 and 3. So that's another thing that I think is a very big challenge. This first volume, when he was writing this, it goes up to the end of 1962. So it's pretty much contained to the Beatles in Liverpool, roughly, and the people surrounding them. Meanwhile, he's also giving an account of musical history in other parts of the world, but generally it's just that Liverpool-centric story. Well, when the Beatles hit worldwide and Beatlemania starts to spread, the perspective now isn't just that Liverpudlian story, but it's a worldwide story. So weaving all that together in a cohesive narrative that's chronological is quite a task. So I think volumes 2 and 3 are much harder to write than volume 1. So those are some of the reasons that I'm aware of that can make this a challenge. And I wanted to let people know that because I do hear negative things about Lewisohn, and people are angry that it's not getting done. And, really, I mean, I've confronted some people that have complained and said, well, hey, would you prefer to have been born 15, 20 years later and trade that for living through the Beatles in real time? Every time I ask that, I hear crickets. I didn't get to live through the Beatles in real time, but there's no guarantee I'm going to read volumes 2 or 3 either. I mean, am I going to make it to the end of this week? I don't know. So, I mean, it's a very bad way to go through life, thinking of the things that you're not going to get after you die. But I guess some people just feel slightly entitled that way. I mean, I'm very happy. I'm so pleased with the way Beatles history is being recorded, not just by Lewisohn, but by others, that if I don't read volumes 2 and 3, I'm just confident that it's going to be well done and it'll be enjoyed by many. So while we are patiently waiting for Mark Lewisohn's volume 2, there's still a lot of other things you can check out there that will give you some really great Beatle history. One would be the 2 podcasts I played for you, Let It Be Beatles and Nothing Is Real. Those are 2 podcasts that had interviewed Mark Lewisohn on a couple of occasions, so it's always great to hear him speak. So I will be reviewing several other books too on the Beatles history that you might want to check out too, and you'll get those here very soon on Pop Goes the 60s.